In the grand, sprawling theater of human history, the reasons for war often feel vast and impersonal. Great conflicts are fought over shifting borders, political ideologies, or the deep, unshakable chasm of religious belief. These are the engines of change we read about in textbooks. But if you look closer into the shadowed corners of the past, you discover that every now and then, the cataclysmic course of a nation's destiny is not altered by an army's march or a philosopher's decree, but by something far more intimate, something dangerously human, a forbidden love, a rivalry steeped in years of silent bitterness, and a desire for revenge so potent it could burn a kingdom to the ground. This is the story of a royal affair so profoundly scandalous, so brazenly public, that its consequences went far beyond a shattered marriage. This affair didn't just break a queen's heart, it shattered a kingdom. It was a love that became a weapon, a passion that became a political crisis, and a family that became two warring factions. The fallout from this relationship would turn brother against brother, nobleman against nobleman, and plunge the powerful nation of Castile into a bloody, protracted civil war that would not only define a generation, but would change its very destiny forever. At the very epicenter of this political and emotional earthquake stood one extraordinary woman, Eleanor de Guzmán. In the annals of history, she is remembered as the king's lover, the royal mistress. But she was so much more than that. She was a political force, a mother of 10 royal children, and a figure of such consuming ambition that her life and her death would provide the spark that set a nation ablaze. Her story is a testament to the fact that sometimes the most powerful person in a kingdom isn't the one wearing the crown, but the one who has captured the king's heart. Our story begins in the turbulent world of 14th century Castile, a powerful and sprawling kingdom in the land we now know as Spain. This was an era of profound and often violent contradictions. It was a time of chivalrous knights who pledged their lives to codes of honor, yet it was also a time of the most ruthless and dirty backroom politics. It was a realm of deep, abiding Christian faith, where the church's power was absolute, yet it was a place where personal ambition and a hunger for power could override any commandment. It was a world of stark beauty and savage cruelty, and ruling over it all was King Alfonso XI. Alfonso was a man forged in the crucible of his time, renowned across the continent for his unyielding strength on the battlefield and his resolute leadership. He was a warrior king, a man who understood power came from the sharp edge of a sword. To secure his kingdom and fortify its borders against its rivals, he did what virtually every monarch of that era did. He made a strategic marriage. His chosen bride was Maria of Portugal, a princess from a neighboring kingdom. Their union designed not for love, but to forge a powerful and unbreakable political and military alliance. It was a transaction of bloodlines, a joining of crowns meant to ensure stability and project strength. But a marriage born of political calculus rarely blossoms into a union of the heart. The duties of the state were fulfilled, the treaty was signed, but the royal bedchamber remained a cold and lonely place. It wasn't long after the formal ceremonies and forced smiles that King Alfonso met the woman who would not just capture his affection, but completely derail his dynasty. Her name was Eleanor de Guzmán y Ponce de León. She was not some commoner who caught the king's eye. She was a formidable figure in her own right, a high-ranking Castilian noblewoman from one of the most powerful families in the realm. In fact, her own lineage was rumored to be touched by royalty, as she was descended from Castilian kings herself. A young widow at just 18, she possessed a potent combination of assets. By all contemporary accounts, she was not merely beautiful, but possessed a staggering intelligence and a charisma that was said to be almost hypnotic. When King Alfonso, a man of war and politics, laid eyes on her, he was utterly and completely captivated. The connection between them was said to be instantaneous, a spark that lit a fire that would consume everything around them. Their bond was intense, passionate, and it defied every convention of the time. In a remarkably short period, Eleanor de Guzmán transitioned from a peripheral figure at court to the king's official, recognized mistress. And this was not some quiet, shame-faced affair, hidden away in secret rooms and conducted through coded letters. Alfonso was not just infatuated, he was besotted, obsessed. He had a legitimate wife, a queen who wore the crown and held the title. But his heart, his time, and frankly, the entire gravity of his court belonged to Eleanor. While the lonely and isolated Queen Maria of Portugal dutifully fulfilled her primary royal obligation, giving the king a legitimate son and heir named Peter, this momentous event did little to sway her husband's affections. If anything, with the line of succession secured, Alfonso's devotion to Eleanor became even more pronounced, more public, more defiant. Soon after his heir was born, the king all but abandoned his wife, leaving her to languish in gilded obscurity. He chose, in a move that shocked the courts of Europe, to live openly and proudly with his mistress. This wasn't merely a passionate fling that had gotten out of hand. It had evolved into a true partnership, a shadow monarchy. Eleanor de Guzmán became, in every practical sense, the de facto queen of Castile. She was no longer just the king's lover. She was the vibrant, magnetic hub of court life. She was his most trusted confidant, his chief advisor, the person whose opinion he sought on matters of state and strategy. If you were a foreign ambassador seeking a treaty, a nobleman petitioning for a title, or a bishop wanting the king's ear, you quickly learned the unspoken rule of Alfonso's court. The path to the king led directly through Eleanor. Her antechamber was more crowded, more influential, and more important than the queen's. She held the power, and everyone knew it. Over the 2 decades they were together, their relationship produced a staggering 10 children, 9 sons, and 1 daughter. Each new birth was a public declaration of the king's unwavering choice and another deep, stinging blow to the queen's public humiliation. These were not children to be hidden away or sent to distant estates. Alfonso didn't just acknowledge his illegitimate brood. He adored them, celebrated them, and showered them and their mother with a fortune in wealth and power. Eleanor was granted vast estates, castles, and titles, transforming her into one of the wealthiest and most powerful landowners in the entire kingdom. Her friends were promoted. Her family members were elevated to the highest positions in the government and the military, creating a vast and powerful faction at the heart of the kingdom that was loyal not to the crown, but to her. Her sons were granted prestigious titles that placed them on equal footing with the oldest and most respected noble houses in Castile. The most capable and ambitious of them was their eldest son, Henry, who was made the Count of Trastamara. It was a significant title, a gift of immense power and prestige from a doting father. But no one could have possibly known at the time that this title, granted to the illegitimate son of a royal mistress, would one day become the name of an entirely new royal dynasty, a dynasty born directly from this scandalous and kingdom-altering affair. As Eleanor's star ascended, casting its brilliant light over all of Castile, Queen Maria's faded into a faint and distant flicker. She was systematically pushed to the side, her role as queen reduced to a ceremonial fiction. She was isolated from the levers of power, her allies at court shunted aside, and she was forced to endure the profound and public shame of her husband's preference. She was often confined to a monastery in Seville, a queen in name only, living the life of a cloistered nun while her rival reigned supreme over the royal court. She pleaded with her husband, not for his love, which she knew was lost, but simply for discretion, for some small measure of respect for her position and for the legitimacy of their son. Alfonso, utterly enthralled by Eleanor, flatly refused. The scandal was no longer just local gossip. It became a matter of international diplomacy. The blatant disrespect shown to a Portuguese princess was an insult that could not be ignored. Maria's father, the powerful king of Portugal, was incandescent with fury at the treatment of his daughter. The dishonor was so great that it threatened to shatter the very alliance the marriage was meant to create. At one point, the situation became so tense that even the Pope in Rome became involved. He felt compelled to intervene, not just to reprimand Alfonso for his adultery, but to actively pressure the King of Portugal into launching an invasion of Castile. The objective was simple and unprecedented: to wage war on a neighboring kingdom for the sole purpose of forcing its king to give up his mistress. For a brief period, the immense political and religious pressure seemed to work. Faced with the threat of excommunication and a war with Portugal, Alfonso reluctantly sent Eleanor to a convent, a symbolic gesture of penance. The court held its breath, wondering if the crisis had been averted. But the moment the political heat subsided and the threat of invasion receded, Eleanor was right back by the king's side, her influence and power undiminished. This open defiance fractured the Castilian nobility. A deep and bitter resentment began to fester. Many of the old, established noble families were furious at the king's flagrant disrespect for sacred tradition and the legitimate line of succession. They watched with growing alarm as Eleanor's illegitimate sons, the royal bastards, were showered with titles, lands, and fortunes that often outshone their own. They saw a shadow royal family taking shape, a court within a court, an entire power structure built on the unstable foundation of a love affair. And a chilling question began to circulate in the halls of their castles. What would happen to this shadow family, and to the kingdom, when the king was no longer around to protect it? The kingdom had become a powder keg of simmering resentment, envy, and fear. At its volatile core were two powerful and opposing forces embodied by two women. The humiliated and forgotten queen, nursing 2 decades of slights, silently waiting in the wings for her chance. And the powerful, beloved mistress, fighting desperately to secure a lasting future for her 10 children in a world that deemed them illegitimate. The entire nation was balanced on a knife's edge. All it needed was a spark to ignite the flames. That spark arrived with shocking and devastating speed in March of 1350. King Alfonso XI, at the height of his power and in the midst of a military campaign to besiege the Moorish stronghold of Gibraltar, was struck down. He was not felled by an enemy sword or a well-aimed arrow, but by an enemy far more powerful and indiscriminate than any army, the Black Death. The plague was scything its way across Europe, and it did not distinguish between king and commoner. Alfonso died suddenly, a vibrant and powerful warrior king reduced to a statistic, gone at just 38 years old. In that single, calamitous moment, Eleanor de Guzmán's world completely and irrevocably fell apart. Her lover, her partner, her staunchest protector, the very source of all her immense power and influence, was gone. The shield that had protected her and her children from a resentful world had vanished. The rules of the game had changed overnight, and the balance of power shifted with the finality of a slamming tomb door. The line of succession, the very thing Eleanor's power had always threatened, was now brutally and undeniably clear. Alfonso's only legitimate son, a teenager named Peter, was now King Peter I of Castile. And who held the real power, ruling as regent for the young, untested king? It was his mother, the Dowager Queen Maria of Portugal. After 2 decades of public humiliation, of forced confinement, of watching her rival showered with the love and power that should have been hers, the scorned queen was finally, unequivocally, in charge. And she had not forgotten a single insult, a single slight, a single moment of her long and bitter exile. Her time for revenge had finally, mercifully, arrived. Queen Maria, now the most powerful woman in Castile, did not waste a single second. Her first, immediate objective was the complete and utter annihilation of the power base her rival had so meticulously constructed over 20 years. She moved with the calculated precision of a woman who had spent years planning this moment. Eleanor, intelligent and politically astute, knew she was in mortal danger. The whispers and accusations began almost immediately. It was alleged that she, fearing for her life and the future of her sons, had started plotting to overthrow the new, young king and place one of her own children on the throne. We will never know if these accusations were true, if she was genuinely plotting a coup, or if she was simply making desperate moves to protect her family from the vengeance she knew was coming. In the end, it didn't matter. The accusation itself was all the justification Maria needed. On the pretext of treason and plotting against the crown, Maria had Eleanor arrested. The fall from grace was as swift as it was merciless. The woman who had been the uncrowned Queen of Castile was unceremoniously thrown into a dark prison cell. Her lands were confiscated, her allies were purged from the court, and her power was systematically dismantled. Then, in 1351, just over a year after Alfonso's death, Eleanor de Guzmán was taken to the town of Talavera de la Reina and executed. Her death was almost certainly ordered directly by Queen Maria, a final, brutal act of vengeance. This was no noble's execution, carried out with a swift and merciful blow from an executioner's sword. Contemporary reports suggest her throat was slit with a common dagger, a brutal, personal, an undignified end designed to send a clear and terrifying message to anyone who had ever aligned themselves with her or who dared to challenge the authority of the legitimate crown. But Maria's revenge, as satisfying as it may have been in the moment, was a catastrophic miscalculation. By killing Eleanor, she hadn't ended the threat. She had merely transformed it. She had not extinguished the fire. She had thrown fuel onto the embers. By brutally murdering their mother, she had not cowed Eleanor's 10 children into submission. Instead, she had given them a cause, a rallying cry, a reason to fight not just for power or survival, but for blood-soaked vengeance. She had created a martyr, and in doing so, she had sealed the fate of the kingdom. The brutal execution of their mother was the final, unforgivable straw for Eleanor's sons. Their grief quickly hardened into a resolve for war. Led by the eldest and most ambitious of the brothers, Henry of Trastamara, they rose up and launched an open, full-scale rebellion against their half-brother, King Peter I. This was the beginning of the Castilian Civil War, a devastating conflict that would tear the kingdom apart at its seams for nearly 2 decades. This was no ordinary war over territory or succession. It was, at its very core, a brother's war, a deeply personal and vicious fight fueled by years of resentment, jealousy, and now, a mother's murder. On one side stood King Peter I, the legitimate heir, a young man determined to assert his rightful authority and crush the illegitimate family that had overshadowed his entire life. His ruthless and often cruel tactics in prosecuting the war would eventually earn him the enduring nickname Peter the Cruel. On the other side was Henry of Trastamara, the charismatic and battle-hardened illegitimate son, fighting to avenge his mother's death and, ultimately, to seize the throne for himself. He was the embodiment of the new power, challenging the old order. The conflict quickly spiraled beyond Castile's borders, escalating into a major international crisis. It became a proxy war for the two great superpowers of the era, England and France, who were already locked in their own epic struggle, the 100 Years' War. Seeing an opportunity to gain an ally and destabilize a rival, each power chose a side. King Peter, the legitimate monarch, naturally allied with the English and their celebrated commander, Edward the Black Prince. In response, Henry of Trastamara secured the backing of France and the neighboring Spanish Kingdom of Aragon, who were eager to see Peter's power checked. The intensely personal fight for the throne of Castile was now just another bloody battlefield in the much larger geopolitical struggle for the control of Western Europe. The war raged across the Iberian Peninsula, a brutal saga of sieges, pitched battles, and stunning betrayals. Loyalties shifted like sand, and the land was soaked with the blood of its own people. Battles were won and lost on both sides, with fortunes rising and falling. For years, neither brother could gain a decisive advantage. The real, final turning point, however, would come in the spring of 1369. This entire, unbelievable story is a perfect and powerful example of how the personal lives, the passions, and the rivalries of royal figures can have earth-shattering consequences, completely changing the history of a nation. If you find these deep dives into historical scandals, power plays, and the human drama behind the crowns and thrones fascinating, make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss what's coming next. And we want to hear from you, so let us know in the comments. Where do you stand on Eleanor de Guzmán? Was she a power-hungry manipulator who selfishly broke a kingdom for her own ambition? Or was she a fiercely protective mother doing whatever it took to shield her children in a ruthless and unforgiving world? The final, dramatic, and deeply personal chapter of the long and bloody Brothers' War played out at the Battle of Montiel in March of 1369. Henry's forces, bolstered by their seasoned French allies under the command of the great Bertrand du Guesclin, decisively crushed King Peter's army. Following the disastrous defeat, Peter fled and took refuge in a nearby castle, but his location was soon discovered. Through a treacherous offer of negotiation, he was lured into a meeting with his half-brother. The two men, sons of the same father but of two rival mothers, met one last time, face to face. There, in a tent, away from the chaos of the battlefield, the political became brutally personal. The simmering hatred that had fueled a 2-decade war erupted into a final, violent struggle. Accounts of the encounter state that the two half-brothers engaged in a physical fight, a desperate, hand-to-hand combat for survival and supremacy. It was there that Henry of Trastamara, the bastard son, drew a dagger and stabbed his brother, King Peter I, to death. With that fatal blow, he not only ended the life of his greatest rival, but also extinguished the last legitimate king from their father's direct line. With Peter the Cruel gone, his cause shattered, Henry of Trastamara was declared King Henry II of Castile. The illegitimate son of the royal mistress had won. Against all odds, against all traditions of monarchy and succession, the boy who, in another life, would have been a minor noble at best, was now the king. His violent and dramatic victory marked the definitive end of the old ruling house of Ivrea and signaled the dawn of a new one, the House of Trastamara. This new dynasty, conceived in a scandalous affair and forged in the purifying fires of a brutal civil war, would go on to rule not just Castile, but eventually most of what we now call Spain for over a century. Eleanor de Guzmán was executed long before she could ever witness her family's ultimate, bloody victory. She never saw her son crowned king, and yet her legacy was nothing short of immense. It was her ambition, her partnership with a king, the 10 children she bore him, and the powerful thirst for vengeance she inspired that led directly to the creation of a new dynasty, one that would fundamentally redefine the course of Spanish history. The civil war that she helped to start had a profound and lasting impact. It weakened the old guard of the Castilian nobility who had opposed her and her family, allowing her son, the new King Henry II, to consolidate his power by creating a new class of nobles, rewarding those who had fought alongside him, and ensuring their loyalty was to his family, the Trastamaras. The ripples of Eleanor's life spread far into the future. Decades later, it would be her own direct descendants who would complete the destiny she had unwittingly set in motion. The famous Catholic monarchs, Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon, the rulers who would finally unite the fractured kingdoms of Spain, complete the centuries-long Reconquista by conquering the last Muslim stronghold in Granada, and famously fund Christopher Columbus's voyage to the New World, were products of her lineage. In a final, poetic twist of history, Queen Isabella I was a descendant of both Eleanor de Guzmán, the Mistress, and her great rival, Queen Maria of Portugal. Generations later, the bloodlines of this bitter, decades-long conflict were finally united in the person who would forge the modern Spanish state. So, the next time you think about the grand, impersonal forces that shape history, the great armies, the sweeping economic trends, the powerful political ideologies, remember the story of Eleanor de Guzmán. Remember that sometimes, the fate of an entire nation can turn on something as fragile and as explosive as a love affair, a bitter rivalry, and a mother's fierce, unyielding determination to secure a future for her children. One woman's life, lived at the very center of power, politics, and passion, left a legacy of blood and fire. But it was a legacy that ultimately, against all odds, paved the way for the birth of modern Spain.